Do you know if your plant is an epiphyte or a terrestrial plant? Stick around with me, and in this video we'll dive into both terrestrial and epiphytic plants and see where they come from, how they're used to growing, and what that means in terms of care. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. But a show of hands down below in the comments, do you know the difference between your terrestrial houseplants and your epiphytic houseplants? Do you even know what those two things mean? I'll wait, let me know down below. Okay. So let's dive into firstly what each of those two things mean. I know some people might be aware of an epiphytic houseplant, potentially aroids as well, but not necessarily just aroids. But epiphytic plants are plants that will generally grow on something, so it will be an epiphyte, as the Greek word that it comes from. It means epi, upon, phyto, which is the phyte, so upon a plant. So it means to grow upon a plant. But this is the thing that a lot of people don't realize. It doesn't mean parasitically. And by that, I mean the plant doesn't harm the host plant or the plant that it's growing on. It's just using it in order to kind of work symbiotically. So for instance, an epiphytic plant, I'll show you here, this is a Monstera. I'm going for the scary vibes as it's like getting close to Halloween. So Monstera esqueleto, kind of apt as well because esqueleto is skeleton, so Halloween, sorry. This is giving me far too much joy. My little kind of goth kid is like living its best life at the moment. But for instance, a lot of Monsteras, I'm pretty sure, I think all Monsteras are epiphytic. I might be wrong. Correct me if you know that I am talking rubbish, and some of them are terrestrial. But epiphytic, so imagine that this would be the side of a tree, another plant, and it would attach to that plant and then also root into whatever media is on the side of that plant. In this case, it's rooted onto a moss pole. Now, I think a lot of people who have been kind of collecting or have got houseplants for a while, especially if you've got your philodendrons, your monsteras, all these things, they've probably heard of epiphytes before, so epiphytic plants. How many of you truly understand what it is to be a terrestrial houseplant or terrestrial aroid, for example? So a terrestrial aroid, some people probably have already said in the comments that, you know what, something like the Philodendron gloriosum or the Philodendron leinamii, and I'm trying to think of other crawling houseplants. So plants that you would imagine would be crawling along the surface of the kind of soil level, and I'll see if I can add a picture here because I was thinking about at least picking up one of those to show you, but too difficult, way too difficult. I don't even think I can actually show you one of the leaves. Possibly this is the Philodendron Dean McDowell here, but yes, partially correct with that one. But some of the examples of terrestrial houseplants that you might have not have thought of and made that connection necessarily, I'll show you not just aroids, although I think most of the ones that I'm going to show you are aroids. So alocasias, I think this is Alocasia sinuata, I think. And this is one that looks a bit like dragon scaly again, very, very tough leaves. So this would grow, as you know, a lot of alocasias will grow in soil. So they are terrestrial. They're not growing off the side of a tree. Another example of an alocasia, so the Alocasia Jacqueline. This is another terrestrial aroid. And then also you've got things like a Colocasia Pharaoh's mask, very, very small one. But this is another one, again, think tubers are growing in the soil level. But how about this? An Aglaonema. And by the way, for the people that were there for the original unboxing of this, it's doing great. I've had a few leaves. I think I'm on the 3rd leaf since I got it, so it's doing quite well. It's not keeping as much of the pink as I would like, but it's definitely got the patterning on the leaves, which I'm completely fine with. But all of these plants are terrestrial houseplants, and by that it means that they are generally found growing in soil, in some form of soil level. It usually will be on the jungle floor, and that might mean different things, but they are not growing upon a plant, so it's not epiphytic. It is growing terrestrial, so terra being the earth basically is growing on the soil level. But as you can imagine, these types of plants come from very different worlds, even if they're in the same wider habitat, I guess. They're from very different worlds, or their perspective on how they're growing is very, very different. And what that might mean in terms of their nutrient absorption, and also how you can essentially make them thrive by emulating what they are expecting and what they're used to having. Now let's talk a bit more about how they absorb their nutrients. Again, this might be going over certain elements that people might know, but stick around, you might learn something a bit newer. So with an epiphytic plant, as you would imagine, because it's got those aerial roots that grow along its stem, and they can actually go within that or attach to that host plant, they are used to having exceptionally light and kind of airy growing media. So I'm not going to say soil specifically for this, because a lot of the aroids don't always have to be rooted in soil. If you think what a tree might look like, it might have nooks and crannies, and that might be where the actual original plant is rooting into, and then kind of supporting itself and possibly getting some more nutrients from the bark of the tree if it's a tree growing up it. The other way they'll get their nutrients would be from the air, from rainwater, from debris, because if you can imagine this is the side of a tree, you would imagine, obviously, it's not a closed environment like what we would have in our houses. So there would be leaf debris, there'd possibly be some bugs, some dead bugs, other things that would get in between that plant and come into contact very closely to its roots. Some of these things might start decaying. That is where it is getting its nutrients. Now, terrestrial plants, and again I'll use the example of the Aglaonema because it's sitting in the actual soil itself, they are getting all of its nutrients from the soil itself. Note that terrestrial houseplants, and specifically aroids, because they're used to growing on the jungle floor, it doesn't necessarily mean pop them into the same soil that you would have in your garden. But with these types of terrestrial plants, they would absorb their nutrients in a more traditional way. So if you think about the way that most plants or vegetables or anything like that we're more kind of used to seeing your garden plants, they'd be getting their nutrients from the water and from the soil itself. But let's look at what the roots look like in kind of contrast to one another. So I'll show you a terrestrial plant now. So this is an allocation. Hopefully it might focus. You should be able to see some roots, and the way that the roots are going through, they're kind of branching out in a more traditional way along the length of that root in order to absorb those nutrients from the soil itself. Conversely, and I'll show you a water propagation. Don't look at the water, it's a bit filthy at the moment. I need to replace it, but shh, you never saw that. But you'd be used to seeing things like aerial roots. And can you tell the difference between this type of a root and a more traditional plant root that might be growing in soil, where there's one kind of white root, maybe a bit thicker, and then you've got the branching roots. I think there's a different word for them. I'll see if I can find it and put it up the top there. And these plants can get those types of roots as well, but they also have these more kind of aerial root structures, which a lot of the terrestrial plants, not all of them, might not have. But let's look again at aroids and their nutrient absorption. So potentially more so in terms of the media that they would be happy growing in. And me and everybody else on the internet who's kind of talking about houseplants, specifically when they're talking about aroids, or even, not aroids, but specifically epiphytes. See, there's that kind of notion that everybody just thought, it's an aroid, so it's an epiphyte. Not all of them. Example, this is a terrestrial aroid. But these plants, you need to bear that in mind when you're thinking about the growing media for them, both in the soil level and especially in something like a moss pole that you might be getting them to attach to. So what I mean by this, and as I said, all of us are basically saying the same thing. We're all sounding like a broken record now. It'll be things like the cocoa coir, it'd be the perlite, it'd be things like orchid bark, anything that's going to give it a lot of air and not going to be dense and compact, because again, think about where they're growing. You don't get dense, compact soil even in the little pockets that you might get on trees where these things might be growing. It's going to be very light and fluffy and airy because that's what they are used to growing up against, essentially. But even if you're growing on something like a plank, consider that a lot of the times, very rarely do you see people, it's not saying that it cannot be done, but if you're growing up a plank, for example, and I've done a whole video about growing plants on a plank, but with those types of scenarios, if you're growing on a plank, you're still kind of realistically going to be growing it on some form of organic matter. It might be a bark, like a section of bark, or it might be a cork board like what I was using. These are all things that they're kind of used to growing. The roots are slightly different in those situations, and hopefully I'll find a picture and put it up somewhere in this section where I can show you, I think it's my Amplicium and my Epipremnum pinnatum, and they are growing on planks of wood, and you can see the difference in what their aerial roots look like in comparison to something like this, which might be growing in a more fluffy media, and I'm really hoping it might pick up. You might see a little white dot there. So these types of roots are going to be different than the roots that you might be seeing attaching on something that's more plank-esque. So a lot of the terrestrial aroids, or terrestrial houseplants, I keep saying aroids because I'm showing you, I think, pretty much all aroids at the moment, but it doesn't just have to be aroids. A lot of the houseplants are terrestrial. If you think about, I'm trying to think now, you know, when you're just drawing a blank, there's a lot of houseplants that are terrestrial. Anything that you would grow into a pot, usually that kind of grows upwards but doesn't need support in the form of a moss pole, would generally be a terrestrial houseplant. But look by comparison, and I showed you the alocasia before, look at the Aglaonema's roots. I mean, this is still rooting in, but these can get very dense root systems because, like traditional plants, they are rooting directly into some form of earth. Now, the thing you also need to remember is for a lot of houseplants, not necessarily just the aroids, a lot of the houseplants that are growing terrestrially, they tend to be from parts of the world where the actual soil is very light and fluffy and airy. So again, you might be getting, so if an epiphyte, I'm trying to pick up an epiphyte now, hold on. If an epiphyte needs a very, very kind of light and airy soil media, so for instance, this isn't growing in exactly that, but for instance, this plant could, because it's an epiphyte, be growing in just some sphagnum moss and some orchid bark, because imagine that's something that it might find in its natural environment to root into at the bottom, so where I would have the roots in the pot in this situation. This would be growing in something a bit more dense, but because it's still going to be on a jungle floor, it's still going to be light and airy, because if you think about a jungle floor, the amount of debris, leaves, twigs, all of these things, it's still going to be quite a fluffy media. It just might mean a bit more moisture retentive. And that is predominantly because they need to be able to absorb, the terrestrial plants need to be able to absorb their nutrients from slightly more dense, moist environments where it might be very, very nutrient rich. So let's talk nutrient uptake for both types and the kind of practical applications of that knowledge. So the way that these plants might actually absorb the nutrients differently would have a significant kind of impact on how you would be caring for these plants, both in terms of watering, but also in terms of fertilizing. So in the case of epiphytic plants, you would need to be doing potentially lighter fertilizing, but more frequently, because again, think about what I was talking about before with all the debris that's falling around the roots or the aerial roots of this specific plant. They're not getting huge amounts of nutrients all the time. They're getting small drips and drabs, a bit more frequently, but more kind of sporadically. It's not constantly there and available to them, because you'd imagine if it rains, it might wash away some of these leaf debris and things like that. So it gets little snippets, little kind of snacks instead of a full meal. So for an epiphyte, you might fertilize with a slightly lighter strength fertilizer, or even getting a regular fertilizer that you're used to using, but maybe diluting it down to half or even a quarter of what maybe the package might say, and maybe do it more frequently. I have said this on my channel several times over. I very rarely stop fertilizing throughout the year. All I do in the winter is I reduce the kind of strength of that fertilizer, but I'm still drip feeding a lot of my epiphytes throughout even the winter months, because that's how they're used to getting their nutrients. Conversely, with terrestrial plants, they're used to growing in kind of more dense soil, where also they've got nutrients available to them all of the time. Because as with most plants that are growing in soil, the nutrients are generally going to be there for them and available probably at higher quantities than you might get with a lot of the epiphytes. What does this mean in practice in terms of how you would care for a terrestrial houseplant versus an epiphytic houseplant? So terrestrial houseplants generally will be a lot happier with something like slow release fertilizer pellets within their soil level, which means that at all given times within their kind of root mass, they will have nutrients available to them, because that's how they're used to growing. Think about it, there's always going to be some form of nutrition within the soil, usually at much higher levels than you might see on the epiphytes. So something like that would generally be beneficial and emulate more of their natural kind of habitat and the natural way that they would grow out and about in their parts of the world. So let's talk some common mistakes for both of these types of houseplants, in kind of hopes that you might be able to avoid it. So one of the things that a lot of people will do with things like an epiphyte would be maybe using the wrong soil or the wrong kind of growing media and go for something very, very dense. Remember before I said do not use regular kind of garden soil for something like this, because it's gonna be too dense, especially if it's in a pot. That's an entirely different topic for a video. If you want to know why you shouldn't be using garden soil in your pots, then do let me know and I can do a video. I will caveat this to death, because I can already hear the people that might follow me from some of the kind of more Oriental countries, India potentially, even like the Mediterranean. And it's like, but I'm growing a lot of these houseplants outside and they're growing in these soils. Yes, there's a difference there, but I'm aware that you can in certain places, under certain scenarios, grow them in the soil. But for a lot of people, maybe in the northern hemisphere where the soil is a lot more dense and a lot more clay heavy, that's not generally going to be a good idea. So having something that is so dense wouldn't work, because they're not used to growing in those types of conditions. Also, another thing that you might kind of struggle with, and one of the common mistakes, is overwatering. How many times have you heard all of us on the YouTubes, on the Instagrams, everywhere talk about the fact that we should all try to avoid overwatering, especially the epiphytes? Because I know what you're all thinking. I know what you're all thinking. In the jungle, it's constantly wet, it's constantly raining. What do you mean, like, we need to be careful with these things? Yes, but there's also winds to factor into that. There's also something to remember, because, okay, this has got a lot, epiphyte, yeah? So this has got a lot of growing material down here. But if you think about it more how it might occur in nature, this might be in the smallest little pocket on a tree, and there might be some moss, and there might be like a couple of leaves, and that might be all that this plant is using to attach its roots to that tree. Then that can get wet and dry very quickly. So they're used to that cycle of letting their roots dry out a lot more between waterings. Something that not a lot of people will talk about when it comes to the more terrestrial houseplants is that lack of nutrients. So say you've got the right kind of growing media for the plant, and the plant is really happy, but you're just like, why is it struggling as much as it is? Have you given it something like a slow release fertilizer? Are you fertilizing it enough? Because those plants that are used to growing in like terrestrially, so in the ground, they're used to having those nutrients available to them, probably in a lot higher quantities than you would do if you had an epiphyte, all of the time. So if you don't have that, it's like somebody who's used to having a meal 7 times a day, for instance, and basically being able to go to a buffet 7 times a day, and that's always what's available. And then all of a sudden you just go, no, 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 no. You're having a tiny little snack for breakfast and maybe a kind of a bit of a stronger meal for dinner. That plant, or that individual in this case, stick with the example memo, that individual would probably get hungry even though like they're still getting meals. That's not what they are used to. Same thing with the plants. You can't go from something that's used to having a buffet available to them pretty much all the time to something that's used to doing kind of smaller snacks along the way. So making sure that you're fertilizing in the correct levels will mean that a lot of your terrestrial houseplants will be happy. And obviously this will depend on your specific plants. Some plants might be terrestrial, but they don't grow in very nutrient-rich conditions, so fertilizing that all the time might be a problem, because that plant, by its nature, because of where it was growing, if it was very kind of poor in terms of nutrients, the soil, then if you give it too much, it will struggle. But then conversely, something that might be growing, like a lot of alocasias and colocaceas, might be growing quite close to rivers. So the water that we were talking about before, the area soil that we were talking about before, but also when things are near rivers, they generally tend to be super fertile because there's debris, there's all these things washing up. It's kind of almost the way that I think about it. I know it doesn't apply all the time, but the banks of a natural river tend to be very nutrient rich because it's all the stuff that kind of gets brought out from the side of like that flowing water. So it has got a lot of nutrition available to it pretty much all the time. One last thing to say about terrestrials is obviously be aware of the growing media that you're using. I know I specifically said some of the terrestrial plants, thinking cactuses for instance, they're terrestrial plants, they grow in the ground. They're used to growing somewhere where there's possibly a very, very fast draining soil, keep to that. But certain of your more tropical houseplants that are terrestrial, growing them in too light of a soil mix. So if you think about growing something like an alocasia that is used to growing kind of potentially near flowing water like rivers and stuff like that, in a cactus soil mix, this plant would be very, very unhappy. You would probably be unhappy as well because you'd be watering far too frequently. So let's come into some final thoughts about this video. Hopefully I haven't bored you to death, but I'm kind of enjoying some of these more geeky topics. I might continue this. Possibly, don't hold me to this, I might try to bring one kind of geek out video a week and then maybe one a bit more light-hearted one to kind of keep everybody and myself happy, I think, for that one. But in summary with this, knowing what type of houseplant and how it would grow naturally in its environment is highly important in relation to how you're going to treat it in terms of what you're going to be growing it in, how you're going to be watering it, and also very specifically how you're going to be fertilizing it, because they are used to two very different things. And we've said this, I am sounding like a broken record. How many times have we said this? Try to go alongside what your plant would be used to getting in nature. Emulate nature as much as possible. Obviously, I know I'm talking and saying this, emulating nature whilst you're growing something that's meant to grow off the side of a tree in a house, I get it, but try to get as close as you possibly can. That's why people created things like moss poles, for example. This is trying to get it as close as possible to what it's used to will generally mean it's happy and it's growing healthily and fast for a lot of people that don't have a lot of patience. Not always, but it can grow a lot faster if you are giving it what it's expecting to get. But yeah, that's everything I wanted to cover in this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.